The rise of the Gangster Disciples. To tell the story of Chicago's largest mob, one must trace both the history of the gangsters and the disciples. Together, their origins and evolution form the foundation of what became the Gangster Disciples Nation. Today, the Gangster Disciples are estimated to have over 40,000 members, ranging from preteens to men in their 70s. Their legacy is one of power, growth, and influence, stretching far beyond the label of street gang. For many members, the Gangster Disciples movement transformed into something larger, growth and development. This philosophy encouraged self-improvement, community involvement, and turning away from crime. While not every member avoided illegal activities, many left the street life behind and became productive members of society under the growth and development banner. The roots of the Gangster Disciples can be traced back to the struggles of the Civil Rights era. Born from communities plagued by poverty, racial discrimination, and violence, the Gangsters and Disciples emerged as organized groups determined to fight back. From the streets of Hyde Park to the distressed neighborhoods of Inglewood, they showed the power of unity and structure. The Egyptian Cobras, 1958. In 1958, the Egyptian Cobras were formed on Chicago's South Side in Fuller Park along Princeton Avenue. Founded by Henry Mickey Cogwell, the Cobras quickly gained popularity for standing up against white gangs, promoting strength in numbers. From their base in Fuller Park, they expanded into Grand Boulevard, Hyde Park, Greater Grand Crossing, South Shore Woodlawn, and Inglewood. The Inglewood Egyptian Cobras. By the late 1950s, Inglewood was undergoing rapid racial change. The construction of the Dan Ryan Expressway displaced many black families, pushing them deeper into Inglewood. The Egyptian Cobras soon established territory stretching from 63rd to 75th Street east of Halsted and from 55th to 59th Street between Normal Avenue and the Dan Ryan. Key figures in this Inglewood Cobra chapter included Bobby Longstreet, Ernest Laverne Longstreet, and Andrew D.D. Howard, names that would later play important roles in GD and BD history. Detective Frank Pape, recalling his time patrolling Inglewood, noted that the Cobras frequently clashed with local white gangs, though their exact rivals remain unclear. The Longstreet brothers' influence would extend beyond the Cobras. Decades later, their nephew Ray Longstreet rose to lead the Four Corner Hustlers during the mid-1990s through mid-2000s, both on the streets and in prison. The birth of the Disciples, 1958. Not long after joining the Cobras, the Longstreet brothers broke away to form their own group. In 1958, Laverne Longstreet, then only 14 years old, spearheaded the creation of the Disciples. Inspired by a biblical reference found by Bobby Longstreet, the name symbolized guidance and unity. Unlike the Cobras, the Disciples were not intended to be a gang at first. Their original mission was community improvement, helping people and providing structure where society had failed. Among the original co-founders were Bobby and Laverne Longstreet. At the time, the Disciples remained largely under the radar, absent from newspapers and unknown to the wider city, because they had not yet taken on the identity of a traditional street gang. The Devil's Disciples, 1960. The early 1960s marked a turning point. On July 17, 1960, multiple Indiana newspapers reported arrests of Egyptian Cobras searching for rivals called the Devil's Disciples. This was the first documented evidence of the Disciples evolving into a recognized street gang. Under new leadership, Charlie Atkins renamed the group the Devil's Disciples to project a more intimidating image. The name, however, was controversial among members, and it gradually pushed the Disciples further into street gang culture. By this time, they found themselves at odds with both the Egyptian Cobras and the rising Blackstone Rangers of Woodlawn. Atkins' leadership was brief. In 1960, he departed to form the Double Six King Cobras, leaving the Disciples with uncertain leadership during the early 1960s. The Disciples in the early 1960s. The early years of the Disciples remain somewhat unclear. Records from that era are scarce, and little was written in the newspapers about their activities. Some sources claim the Disciples didn't formally exist until 1963, while others insist they were present as early as 1958. What we do know is that by July 17, 1960, several Northwest Indiana newspapers reported that members of the Egyptian Cobras had been arrested while searching for rivals known as the Devil's Disciples. This report provides the first documented proof of the Disciples' existence on Chicago's South Side, supporting street legends that trace the group's origins back to 1958. According to those accounts, the Disciples were originally made up of preteens and young teenagers. That timeline makes sense when considering Laverne Longstreet, who would have been only 14 years old in 1958, a fitting age for starting such a youth group. By 1963, however, Laverne was 19 and already too old to have been considered a founder of a teen club. Most likely, the Disciples did exist before 1963, but they remained a small, loosely organized club rather than a full-fledged gang. 1961, the origin of the Gangsters. In order to understand the Disciples' rivals, we must also look at the beginnings of the Gangsters. Andrew D.D. Howard, born in 1945, was one of the earliest key figures. By the early 1960s, Howard had joined the Egyptian Cobras in Chicago's public housing projects before moving to Englewood near Ogden Park. There, he created his own faction known as the 68th Street Cobras, based at 68th and Racine. In 1961, Howard crossed paths with two young boys from the neighborhood, Larry Hoover and his close friend Ike Taylor. Both were only about 10 or 11 years old at the time, but Howard recruited them into his Cobra faction. This marked the very beginning of Larry Hoover's involvement in street gang culture. By 1964, Hoover and his peers, about 30 preteen boys, gathered regularly at his apartment at 68th and Green. From the window, they watched local pimps and hustlers outside the Guys and Gals nightclub, admiring their style and power. Hoover, wanting to embody that same presence, began to carry himself like a leader. The Egyptian Cobras, meanwhile, evolved into what later became the Mickey Cobras, the Cabrini Green Disciples. While the Disciples were establishing themselves on the south side, they also began to spread into Chicago's near north side, particularly Cabrini Green. The exact year remains uncertain, but most accounts place the expansion in the early 1960s. The Disciples were introduced to Cabrini Green by Richard Champ Strong, born in 1946. Some claim Strong briefly led the Disciples after Charlie Atkins stepped away, though others argue he never held leadership within the group. What is known is that by the mid-1960s, Strong had formed the Black Family Deuces in Cabrini Green. Eventually, the Deuces joined forces with the Disciple Nation, and when the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, BGDN, formed in 1969, the Deuces were absorbed into it. This made them the first official Disciple-affiliated group in Cabrini Green, laying the foundation for the strong GD presence that area would become known for. David Barksdale, 1963. Though Nice David Barksdale, born May 24, 1947 in Salis, Mississippi, was the son of a preacher. He moved with his family to Chicago in 1957 at the age of 10. Within a few years, Barksdale became involved in street life, starting a small crew of his own in Englewood around 1960. Barksdale spent time in a juvenile detention facility, but returned to the streets in 1963 at age 16. He quickly became a rising figure, taking leadership of the East Side Disciples in Hyde Park. Based around 53rd and Kimbark, Barksdale and his faction began consolidating power. Although many later believed David Barksdale founded the Disciples, this was not the case. The original founders were already in place years earlier. What Barksdale did, however, was revitalize the organization. Under his leadership, the Disciples grew in strength and visibility, cementing his reputation as one of their most influential leaders. The Disciple Nation, 1963. In 1963, Laverne Longstreet once again stepped forward to organize the Disciples into something larger. He cleared out the basement of his family home at 66th and Eggleston in Englewood and called a meeting of top disciples. From that gathering, the Disciple Nation was born. This new structure united multiple disciple groups under one banner, including the Devil Disciples and Barksdale's East Side Disciples. It was also during this time that the group adopted two of its most enduring symbols, the pitchfork, introduced by Laverne Longstreet, and the 6-point star, suggested by Leonard Longstreet. Both symbols represented the growing unity of the Disciple Nation. By 1965, leadership had shifted fully to David Barksdale as Longstreet stepped aside. Under Barksdale's guidance, the Disciple Nation expanded beyond Englewood and Hyde Park, establishing itself in multiple Southside neighborhoods. This marked the true beginning of the Disciples as a major force in Chicago street culture. The organization maintained several headquarters in Englewood, including a site at 6039 South Halstead Street and another at 444 West 63rd Street near Normal Avenue, not far from where Barksdale lived. Both buildings have since been demolished, but in the 1960s they served as central meeting points for the rapidly expanding Disciple Nation. Woodlawn. In 1963, the Disciples began one of their first major expansions by moving into the western side of the Woodlawn community, west of Woodlawn Avenue. They quickly took control of nearly 2/3 of the neighborhood. The remaining third was dominated by the Blackstone Rangers and the Cobras. Over time, the Disciples secured their section of Woodlawn permanently, maintaining a stronghold there for decades. The timing of their arrival coincided with the last white families leaving West Woodlawn in the early 1960s, creating space for the gang to establish themselves. South Shore. That same year, in 1963, the Disciples also advanced into South Shore. However, they initially concentrated south of 71st Street, where white families were still living. By the early 1960s, the Blackstone Rangers and the Cobras had already taken the northern half of the neighborhood. As African American families began moving south of 71st Street, they encountered racial hostility and unrest. The Disciples slowly followed this migration, eventually becoming the dominant force in South Shore by the early 1970s. From Sircon City to Lakeside, this area has remained one of the gang's strongest footholds. Greater Grand Crossing. The transformation of Greater Grand Crossing began around 1950 when the community started shifting from white to African American. This change started in the northern section, where Parkway Gardens, better known today as Old Block, stands. In the 1950s and early 1960s, 71st Street served as a dividing line between white and black communities. From Inglewood to South Shore, most white residents remained south of 73rd until the mid-1960s. The Egyptian Cobras and Blackstone Rangers pushed into the north side in the late 1950s, but by 1963, the Devil's Disciples began claiming territory south of 71st Street. These areas were largely untouched by gangs at the time, making them prime ground for takeover. The Disciples quickly seized control, and to this day, the southern part of Greater Grand Crossing remains one of their strongholds. Washington Park. The Washington Park community is often mistaken as part of Inglewood or Bronzeville, but it is its own neighborhood. Its boundaries stretch from 53rd to 63rd Streets, between Martin Luther King Drive and State Street on the west, and eastward to Cottage Grove Avenue. Historically, Washington Park was one of Chicago's earliest examples of white flight and blockbusting, beginning as far back as the 1910 and 1920. Originally built as an upper-class white community, it declined rapidly as African American families moved in during the Great Depression era. By 1963, when the Disciples were rising in power, most of Washington Park was still free of major gangs, aside from the Cobras and the Robert Taylor homes near 51st and State. Many middle-class black families lived here, which delayed gang activity for a time. But as the neighborhood grew poorer in the mid-1960s, the Disciples moved in, claiming control. Today, both GDs and BDs would continue to dominate Washington Park. Expansion to the south side, 1964. By the mid-1960s, a wave of blockbusting swept through Chicago's further south side neighborhoods. Between 1963 and 1965, many white families fled these communities. White property values plummeted, while black families moved in under unfair conditions, often pushed into new ghettos. This dramatic shift opened the door for the Disciples to expand even further south. Auburn-Gresham. In Auburn-Gresham, white flight began around 1963. Black families first moved into the eastern part of the neighborhood, near 82nd and Morgan, and later around 79th and Halsted. The Maniac Disciples established themselves near 79th and Halsted, offering protection to incoming black families facing racial violence. By the mid-1960s, the Blackstone Rangers had also moved in, sparking conflict between the two gangs. As white residents continued to leave, both groups spread westward. Auburn-Gresham will ultimately become a lasting stronghold for the Disciples. Why the Disciples were needed. The rise of the Disciples cannot be separated from the racial realities of the era. In these transitioning neighborhoods, black families, especially youth, faced constant hostility, which fueled the growth of street gangs. Bullying in schools. White students often targeted black classmates with slurs and unequal treatment. Biased teachers. Black students were punished more harshly than white students, sometimes for things they hadn't even done. Unfair boundaries. Even after restrictive covenants were struck down in 1948, white communities created their own unofficial borders. Black residents were kept from pools, parks, and shopping areas. Crossing those invisible lines often meant facing harassment or violence. Police discrimination. New black residents were heavily surveilled by police. In racial conflicts, whites were often let go, while black residents were arrested or even beaten. These daily struggles pushed young African Americans toward gangs like the Disciples, who offer protection, identity, and a sense of belonging. While the early conflicts between whites and blacks faded quickly due to rapid white flight, the legacy remained. Once established, the Disciples shifted their focus to rivalries with groups like the Rangers, but their origins were rooted in the fight for survival during racial transition. The Guerrilla Gangsters of 68th Street, 1965. In 1965, a 14-year-old Larry Hoover broke away from the Cobras and formed his own group, the Guerrilla Gangsters. Despite his young age, Hoover had already proven himself as a capable leader. His vision attracted many, even former Cobra leader DD, who joined under Hoover's command. The original lineup of Guerrilla Gangsters included Larry Hoover, Ike Taylor, Andrew Howard. 1966, the Gentleman Gangsters and the rise of the drug trade. The Guerrilla Gangsters name was short-lived. By 1966, Hoover's crew rebranded themselves as the Gentlemen Gangsters. The new name reflected their reputation. They carried themselves with respect toward elders in the community, yet they were still gangsters. They helped locals when possible, but they also believed that real gangsters had to make money. It was during this time that Hoover and his men met Tex, a young man from Texas who was a few years older than them. Tex introduced the group to drug dealing, setting the foundation for Hoover's future role in the narcotics trade. While Ike Taylor chose not to participate, many of the gents got involved. This made the Gentlemen Gangsters the first street organization in Chicago to engage in large-scale drug trafficking. The Douglas Projects, E. to B. Wells, 1966. As the Disciples expanded northward into Bronzeville, the I. to B. Wells Projects became prime ground. Originally built as a grassroots housing development, the projects deteriorated in the 1960s as more low-income families moved in. By 1966, both the Disciples and the Black P. Stones fought bitterly for control of the buildings. Over the years, the GDs established dominance in much of the area stretching from 37th and MLK to Cottage Grove. When the GD-BD split occurred in early 1980, GDs held territory west of Vincennes, while BDs occupied the buildings east of Vincennes to Cottage Grove. These battles raged until the projects were demolished in the late 2000s. The Clarence Darrow Projects, 1966, built as an extension of I. to B. Wells in the early 1960s, the Clarence Darrow Project quickly collapsed under poverty and neglect. By 1966, the Disciples had taken over, with strong concentrations around 39th and Langley, home of the Darrow Homes gangsters DHGs. When the GDBD split came in the 1980s, these Disciples sided with the gangster concept and remained GDs until the buildings were eventually torn down in the 2000s. The Madden Park Projects, 1970. The Madden Park Projects were the newest addition to the I. to B. Wells Darrow Madden cluster, opening in 1970. But unlike I. to B. Wells, Madden Park never enjoyed a grassroots foundation. From the start, it was plagued by crime, poverty, and poor management. Both GDs and BDs fought for control after the split, battling one another until the projects were demolished in the 2000s. The Dearborn Homes, 1966. The Dearborn Homes, built in 1950, were among Bronzeville's oldest public housing sites. By 1966, both the Disciples and the Black P. Stones had moved in, sparking violent clashes through the late 1960s and 1970s. By the early 1980s, the Stones had exited, replaced by the Mickey Cobras. The Disciples of 27th Street aligned with the gangster side of the split, remaining GDs and continuing to battle the Cobras in these buildings to the present day. Stateway Gardens, 1966. Before the Disciples arrived in 1966, Stateway Gardens was dominated by the Dell Vikings, but once inside, the GDs became a major force. When Richard Cole Black Doherty's was released from prison in 1981, he pushed the GD concept hard and solidified control of the northern towers from 35th to 38th Streets. Stateway became one of the GD's most profitable drug markets, generating millions through the 1980 and 1990. GD stationed rooftop snipers with infrared scopes to protect their trade. In the 1990s, brutal wars erupted between GDs and BDs inside the towers, costing countless lives. The violence only ended when the city tore the buildings down in the 2000s. Shortly after Cold Black was killed, most of the Dell Vikings eventually flipped to the Black Disciples in the late 1980s. Prairie Courts, 1966. Originally built in 1951 to house senior citizens, Prairie Courts shifted to low-income families by the mid-1960s. When maintenance collapsed, gangs filled the void. The Disciples moved in soon after the formation of the Disciple Nation. Located between 27th and 30th along MLK Drive, these projects became GD territory after the 1980 split, remaining under their control until demolition in the 2000s. Grand Boulevard and the Robert Taylor Homes, 1966. Grand Boulevard, like Douglas, was once home to some of Chicago's earliest African-American gangs, but their influence ended when the Disciples launched an aggressive campaign to conquer Bronzeville in 1966. At first, the Cobras controlled the Robert Taylor Homes, but the Disciples soon began to spread through the massive housing complex. After the GD-BD split, the buildings were divided. GDs held the north, BDs the center, and Cobras the southern section known as the Whole. Through the 1980, 1990, and 2000, GDs dominated the drug trade here. They controlled access to the buildings, turning away outsiders and sometimes killing those who resisted. Crack cocaine was the main profit source, and the gang protected it fiercely. Armed sentries and rooftop snipers ensured no rivals could intrude. By 2006, when the city demolished the Robert Taylor Homes, the GD's reign ended, but their presence in Grand Boulevard streets remained strong. Near Southside, the Hilliard and Nick Projects, 1966, In 1966, the Raymond Hilliard public housing projects opened, and the Disciples moved in almost immediately. Over the following years, the buildings became a stronghold for the gang. By the early 1980s, the residents there leaned fully toward the gangster side, making the towers a base for the Gangster Disciples. The Harold Ickes projects had been completed earlier in 1955. At first, they were meant as a grassroots housing initiative, but by the mid-1960s, when the Housing Authority began moving in low-income families, the city refused to cover the cost of unpaid rent. The buildings soon fell into neglect and disrepair. Once the Disciple Nation was formed, both Disciples and Black P. Stones laid claim to much of the Ickes. By the time of the GDBD split in the early 1980s, the Disciples there sided with the gangsters, repping the GD name until the city demolished the projects in 2009. Between the late 1960s and the 2000s, countless drug wars and gang conflicts erupted within these walls, and the GDs were at the center of much of it. Oakland, the Madden Projects. The Madden Project spanned two neighborhoods, and each side had its own story. On the Oakland side, the Gangster Disciples were strongest, particularly in the eastern section. Meanwhile, the nearby Ida B. Wells and Darrow projects leaned more toward the Black P. Stones and BDs. This division set the stage for decades of rivalry. Community involvement 1966. The year 1966 also marked a turning point in how the Disciples presented themselves. They became active in the community through fundraisers, legitimate businesses, and efforts to keep children in school. While some of their money was tied to illegal activities, a significant portion was directed toward helping the neighborhood. David Barksdale himself used his influence for both power and community benefit. The Disciples forged connections with civil rights groups and spoke out against injustices. That summer, they even attempted a peace treaty with the Blackstone Rangers. Though the truce was short-lived, the effort itself was notable. In 1967, the Woodlawn organization received more than $927,000 in federal funds to establish job training centers for youth. Both the Blackstone Rangers and the Black Disciples were put in charge of running the programs. Instructors were paid salaries despite lacking formal training, and many were gang members themselves. The Disciples received about $360,000, 0 cents of the fund, but instead of uniting the community, the initiative sometimes brought violence into the classrooms, with fights and even shootings breaking out among rival groups. The birth of the Gangster Nation, 1968. In 1968, Larry Hoover, Ike Taylor, and Andrew Howard of the Gentleman Gangsters introduced the Supreme concepts. This marked the creation of the Supreme Family, an alliance of gangs under the banner of the Gangsters. The Gentleman Gangsters were renamed the Supreme Gangsters, with Hoover as their leader. Ike Taylor carried the movement west, founding a branch in K-Town. Soon after, other groups joined, including the Imperial Gangsters of Inglewood. Every organization that aligned with the Gangster Nation adopted gangster as part of their name to show loyalty. The Supreme Gangsters adopted black as their color. Their symbols included a heart with wings and a crowned sword. Members saluted each other with a clenched fist, a sign of unity. Westside Expansion, K-Town, 1968. In September 1968, Ike Taylor, newly released from juvenile detention, moved with his family to Glass and Keeler in K-Town on Chicago's west side. There, he began spreading the gangster vision among local youth, most of whom were familiar only with the Vice Lords and Egyptian Cobras. Taylor recruited heavily, even convincing many Egyptian Cobras to join his new branch. With Robert Red Lawson as his sergeant-at-arms, the first Supreme Gangster branch was born. This was the beginning of the Gangster Disciples' presence on the west side. Their influence grew quickly. The Supreme Gangsters absorbed other local gangs, including the Black Pimps and Jive 5. This expansion gave them momentum and allowed them to take control of the Henry Horner projects, cementing their place in West Garfield Park and the near west side. Their main opposition was the Vice Lords, but the GDs continued to spread in territory where few Stones or Disciples had been before. King Ike Taylor. By the early 1970s, Taylor's rise came to a halt when he was convicted of attempted murder. In the case of People vs. Taylor, 1974, he and several associates were accused of ambushing Albert Harris, leaving him permanently scarred and partially blinded. Taylor was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Though convicted, Taylor would later become known as a positive leader, advocating for the growth and development principles of the Gangster Disciples. The Black Disciple Nation, 1968. That same year, David Barksdale officially registered the name Black Disciples. Initially, it was meant only for use in community programs and grant applications, since Devil's Disciples would never be approved by the government. However, the name quickly spread to the streets, and within a short time, it became the accepted title for the entire Disciple Federation. Circle and Gangsters of South Shore, 1968. As African Americans moved into Chicago's South Shore during the late 1960s, they faced racial hostility and pressure from both white residents and rival gangs. In 1968, Swan, one of the original founders of the Disciples, established the Gangster Disciples in the area around 75th Street. The group grew quickly during the 1970s as white flight transformed the neighborhood. Gangster City, as the area became known, stretched from 72nd to 75th. By 1981, when the GDBD split occurred, the Gangsters declared allegiance to the gangsters and became known as the Gangster Gangsters. For years, the area served as a meeting ground and even a headquarters for the GDs. The Boss Pimps, 1968. Another branch formed in 1968 under Jack Black, one of the earliest Disciples. His crew, originally called the Boss Pimp Disciples, was based around 59th and May in Inglewood. They fought rival Hispanic gangs like the Latin Souls and Emerald Knights, as well as the King Cobras. When the BGD split happened, Jack Black aligned the Boss Pimps with the Gangsters, but after his death or retirement, the group turned renegade, sometimes even fighting other GD factions. They remain active today. Gangsters in Roseland, 1968. In Roseland, the local underworld was long controlled by a drug dealer known as Brick. Both Rangers and Disciples often worked for him, moving drugs for money, but Brick's reign began to crumble in 1968 when a young leader named Ulysses Floyd, known as U.S. rose through the ranks of the Blackstone Rangers. That summer, Andrew Howard introduced Floyd to Larry Hoover. Floyd agreed to join the Supreme Gangsters and established a Roseland branch at 95th Street. His influence stretched north to 79th Street and south into what would later be known as the Wow Hundreds. After forcing Brick out, Floyd and his crew took over the drug trade, but unlike Brick, they reinvested in the community. Their power brought many disciples into alliance with them, and by 1969, the Roseland area became firmly tied to the Gangster Disciples. Wentworth Gardens, Armour Square, 1968. In 1968, the Supreme Gangsters planted their flag in Armour Square, just south of White Sox Park. That's when the Wentworth Gardens projects, once a proud community, started earning the nickname Murder Town. The specific branch of the gangsters that settled here isn't certain, but one thing's clear: they dug in deep. Decades later, they're still holding it down. Built in 1944 specifically for African American families, these projects are some of the oldest black housing developments in Chicago. West Englewood, 1968. By 1968, the Supreme Gangsters flooded into West Englewood, right as racial tensions boiled over. White gangs had been roaming near Ogden Park since the mid-60s, sparking conflict. That drew in the Blackstone Rangers, who set up shop in the central part of the neighborhood. But blockbusting in 1964 pushed white families out fast, especially between 63rd and 67th. Ashland to Western, the gangsters moved into northern West Englewood, clashing with the Stones for those same blocks. By the mid-70s, white residents were completely gone, even those around 55th Street. The High Supreme Gangsters locked down 67th and Marshville, right along the old racial boundary. When the Italians left in 1973, the gangsters expanded further south to 75th. That's why West Englewood today is one of the strongest GD territories in Chicago. Burnside, 1968. Burnside, a small community north of Roseland, stayed white much longer than most South Side areas, but by the mid-60s, blockbusting realtors pressured white families between 93rd and 95th to sell, and black families moved in. Along with them came the gangs. The Supreme Gangsters pushed into northern Roseland and then crossed into Burnside in 1968, claiming the stretch between 93rd and 95th. By the 70s, Disciple founder Jack Black himself moved in, bringing his Boss Pimps crew. Since then, Burnside had been a GD-heavy area, a legacy of that 1968 push. Washington Heights, 1968. Washington Heights started as a white middle-class stronghold. By the 1950s, though, middle-class black families began settling in, hoping for peace away from Bronzeville struggles. For a while, things were calm, until blockbusting tore through in the mid-60s. The Rangers arrived first in 1964, dominating the east side near Roseland. By the late 60s, as whites fled west of Vincennes, the outlaw Supreme Gangsters claimed the rest. The 1970 census showed the neighborhood was already 75% black. By 1980, it was 98%. Those outlaw Supreme Gangsters eventually became the GDs that still control the streets today. Chatham, 1968. Chatham was once a shining example of Chicago's white middle class. Some white residents here even pushed back against blockbusting and welcomed black middle class families in the 50s. For a time, it worked, but by the mid-60s, blockbusting was too powerful and poverty crept in. Still, Chatham stayed more stable than most neighborhoods, but gangs came anyway. By 1964, the Blackstone Rangers had moved into the southern part, south of 87. 4 years later, the outlaw Supreme Gangsters claimed the northern side, the bigger half of Chatham. To this day, GGs remain the dominant force here because they grabbed that ground early. Calumet Heights, 1968. In the 1950s, African-American doctors and professionals moved into Pill Hill, the wealthiest part of Calumet Heights. For a while, black businesses thrived here. But once the mid-60s blockbusting wave hit the far south side, Calumet Heights was targeted like its neighbors. The outlaw Supreme Gangsters arrived in 1968, quickly making their presence felt. Even after many middle-class families left, GDs have continued to be strong in this area. East Garfield Park, 1968. The Supreme Gangsters didn't stop on the south side. In 1968, they crossed into East Garfield Park, setting up around the Ike Sims apartments. The GDs kept their foothold for decades, even linking up with some black soul groups to move money together. That partnership eventually created the Gangster Black Souls. Near West Side, Henry Horner Projects, 1968. The Near West Side has always been a breeding ground for major gangs. In 1968, the Supreme Gangsters stormed the Henry Horner Projects. Back then, the buildings were still grassroots, but it didn't take long for things to change. By the 80s, the GDs were moving heavy product here. They controlled multiple buildings, like the Mob Building at Madison and Winchester, and the Dub G's territory around Washington and Walcott. The GDs stayed strong until the projects were demolished in 2010. Near Westside Rockwell Gardens, 1968. The gangsters also claimed the Rockwell Gardens projects in 68, starting with 340S Western. At first, these buildings weren't as wild, but by the 80s, the drug trade exploded here, and GDs were right at the center until the projects came down in 2006. North Mondale, 1968. North Lawndale has long been Vice Lord territory. Still, the Supreme Gangsters managed to carve out space in 1968. They came with guns and hustle, flipping many Egyptian Cobras into gangsters. That's why the once powerful Cobras faded so quickly. Despite Vice Lord dominance, GDs survived here for decades and remain in the area even today. West Humboldt Park, 1968. West Humboldt Park saw violent transitions in the late 60s. Puerto Rican families and the Latin Kings pulled out, while poor black families moved in. That sparked fierce battles between black and Hispanic gangs. At first, the Black Souls dominated the area, but when the Supreme Gangsters showed up in 1968, they clashed hard. One murder even made the newspapers in the early 70s, but in mid-70s, the Black Souls backed out, and the gangsters grew even stronger. Today, GDs run deep around Huron and Homan, stretching north toward Division, often clashing with both black and Latino gangs. The Gangster vs. Disciple War in 1968. In 1968, war erupted between the Disciples and the Supreme Gangsters. Larry Hoover himself was nearly killed multiple times, twice by gunfire and once on September 4th at Parker High School. That day, Disciple members James Highsmith and Leonard Longstreet spotted Hoover near the principal's office. Longstreet shouted, "Burn him!" and Highsmith pulled a pistol, shooting Hoover and 2 others. No one died, but Highsmith got 15 years in prison. Ironically, he later became a respected BGD. The fall of 1968 was bloody. Guns went off across the south side as Disciples, Gangsters, and Stones all fought. A truce was attempted, but it didn't hold. The truth was, many of the top leaders, Hoover, Barksdale, Jeff Fort, were friends. They never wanted this war, but they couldn't control every faction, and younger crews made their own moves, igniting the bloodshed. Larry Hoover and Jeff Fort. By early 1969, Larry Hoover's gangsters had grown into the 3rd largest organization on Chicago's South Side. This sudden rise caught the attention of both David Barksdale and Jeff Fort. Jeff Fort, leader of the Black P Stones, reached out to Hoover with interest in forming an official alliance. Now this is where history gets debated. Some claim Larry Hoover became a Stone, while others strongly deny it. The truth lies somewhere in between, but one fact is clear: Larry Hoover was never a Stone. In January 1969, Hoover and Fort held a peaceful meeting. What they agreed on was not a merger, but a truce. It was an alliance in name only, keeping the 2 organizations separate. Hoover wanted to lead alongside Jeff Fort as equals, but Fort would never allow it. He believed no one stood on his level. At one point, Fort even proposed merging both groups under a new name, the Gangster Stones, but Hoover refused, unwilling to be placed beneath Fort's authority. The peace was fragile, and by May 1969, it had collapsed. A shooting involving Stones and Supreme Gangsters near Hoover's home ended whatever alliance remained. End of the Gangster-Stones alliance? On May 7, 1969, a confrontation broke out at 69th and Halstead in Inglewood. Supreme Gangsters Ronald Vandergriff and Gregory Sanders ran into members of the Black P. Stones' Double Six Kings faction. An argument quickly turned violent when Charlie Stone Smith pulled a revolver and shot Vandergriff, striking him in the thigh. Bullets also grazed Felix Murray, another Supreme Gangster nearby. The wounded men escaped and made their way to Larry Hoover's family home at 68th and Green before being taken to the hospital. At first, the Stones apologized and claimed they hadn't realized the Supreme Gangsters were allies. A reconciliation meeting was even held at BPS headquarters, where the shooting was ruled an accident, but within weeks, the truce completely unraveled. Vandergriff later cooperated with police and testified about the incident. By then, war between Stones and gangsters was back in full force. The birth of the BGD in June 1969, Larry Hoover sat down with David Barksdale inside the St. Stephen's Parish house at 6455 South Peoria in Inglewood. There, the two men created a historic alliance, the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, BGDN. This new structure united the Supreme Gangsters and their allies under Hoover and all disciple gangs under Barksdale, now officially known as the Black Disciples. Together, they would move as one combined force. Leadership was formalized. Hoover and Barksdale both carried the title of king. Below them stood their trusted princes, and under that a hierarchy of dons, generals, and chiefs. The structure was modeled partly on organized crime families, giving the BGDN a disciplined, almost military chain of command. For many on the streets, titles blurred. Young members no longer called themselves gangsters or disciples. Instead, they proudly identified as BGDs, Black Gangster Disciples. LSD, Lords, Stones, and Disciples. Later that same year, in June 1969, a coalition was born that shocked the city, the LSD Alliance. Lords, Stones, and Disciples. For a time, the three largest organizations in Chicago united to fight for civil rights, better housing, and jobs for their communities. This was not just about gangs, it was about politics, economics, and power. Together, they marched on City Hall and pressured Chicago's construction industry to hire more African Americans. Their efforts even produced the Chicago Plan, which promised thousands of jobs and training opportunities. The alliance reduced violence for a short time, but by the early 1976, the plan faltered, the unity dissolved, and the old wars returned. Expansion to Uptown and the 4848. In 1969, Chicago began busing Southside African American students to Senn High School on the far north side. Among them were members of the Black Gangster Disciples. Many families eventually settled near Lawrence and Winthrop in Uptown, Chicago's oldest Black enclave outside Cabrini Green. In 1970, the notorious 4848 building was built at Lawrence and Winthrop as public housing. BGDs quickly took control, turning it into both a stronghold and a major drug hub. Their presence in Uptown became permanent, marking one of the earliest North Side expansions. The Deep 100 and Altgeld. Also in 1969, the gangsters spread into Chicago's far south side, the so-called Deep 100S, including West Pullman, Morgan Park, Riverdale, and South Deering. These neighborhoods were undergoing rapid white flight and racial clashes, and the gangsters seized the opportunity to establish dominance. In Riverdale's Altgeld Gardens projects, both disciples and gangsters took root alongside Black P. Stones. But the BGDs gained the upper hand and built lasting control that still echoes in the projects today. Permanent settlements, 97th and Cottage Grove. Pullman, racial clashes with whites brought the BGDs and Stones into conflict. West Pullman, blockbusting and white flight opened the door for BGDs, who soon clashed with Stones. Morgan Park, long-standing racial tensions erupted in 1969 and the BGDs moved in, becoming the dominant force up to the present day. Jeffrey Mano and the Trumbull Park projects. By 1969, racial tension was again boiling in the South Deering community. In the Jeffrey Manor neighborhood and the Trumbull Park housing projects, white flight was changing the landscape. As African American families moved in, many white residents reacted with hostility. These clashes echoed the infamous 1953 Trumbull Park riot, but unlike then, the new wave of conflict went largely unreported. By the late 1960s, the projects were majority African American, but the surrounding neighborhood was still heavily white. Into this volatile environment stepped the Black Gangster Disciples, then operating as the Supreme Gangsters. In 1969, they moved into Jeffrey Manor in Trumbull Park, positioning themselves as protectors for Black youths under constant racial pressure. For over a decade, the BGDs were the only structured group standing with the Black community in South Deering. In the early 1980s, outside rivals arrived. conservative vice lords, Latin kings, Latin counts, and Spanish vice lords. Battles followed, and while some stayed briefly, most eventually left. What remained permanent was the legend of the Jeffrey Manor GDs, a legacy that still carries weight today. Rockford GDs, 1969. It may surprise some that the first Illinois city outside Chicago to identify with the Disciples was Rockford. Their presence began in 1969, the same year new public housing opened on the west side. Many of the families who moved in were from Chicago, and with them came the Disciples' name. Local newspapers and court documents from the early 1970s make it clear. By then, Disciples were firmly established in Rockford. A 1984 article directly identified them as Black Gangster Disciples, confirming their roots in the late 1960s. The city attempted to erase them by tearing down housing projects in the late 70s, but it backfired. The GDs simply relocated, spreading across the west side and even near downtown. By the late 1980s, they were deeply embedded in the crack cocaine trade, selling at a pace that drew desperate addicts in droves. In 1993, police carried out a massive crackdown, but Rockford GDs bounced back stronger than ever. Today, their numbers remain deep. Historically, the Rockford GDs trace directly back to the supreme gangster side of the organization. The shooting of David Barksdale, 1970. Since 1968, David Barksdale had been negotiating peace with leaders of the Black P-Stones, but every attempt was fragile. In June 1970, a shaky truce was in place until June 7th, when disaster struck. That night, at a bar on 69th in Peoria, a Stone member nicknamed Suitcase Charlie accidentally dropped a rifle. The gun fired and the bullet struck Barksdale in the side. Larry Hoover, standing nearby, reacted immediately. He rushed Barksdale into his car and sped him to St. Bernard Hospital, a move credited with saving Barksdale's life. Though he survived, the injury caused permanent kidney damage. It was the beginning of the slow decline in King David's health. Cabrini Green, 1970. In the same year, Larry Hoover expanded his reach into Cabrini Green, one of Chicago's most notorious housing projects. There, he linked with the Black Deuces, a Disciples set, and built an early heroin pipeline. The partnership pulled disciple groups closer to gangster concepts, but it also sparked deadly conflict with the Cobber Stones, who already had a presence in the projects. By the summer of 1970, the war in Cabrini Green turned deadly. In July, national headlines erupted when 2 Chicago police officers were shot and killed by rooftop snipers. The violence exposed the intensity of the struggle for control inside the projects. In 1971, disciple leader Richard Strong formed a civil rights group called BL.ACK, aiming to fight poverty and injustice in Cabrini Green. Yet the gang wars surrounding the projects often overshadowed those community efforts. Dodge, indictments. The early 1970s brought federal investigations into gangs using government anti-poverty funds for illegal operations. In 1971, charges landed hardest on the Black P-Stones. By 1972, Jeff Ford himself was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The vice lords also suffered crippling blows, with businesses shut down and leaders indicted. Prosecutors then turned their attention to the Black Gangster Disciples. A disciple named Mingo even testified before a grand jury against his own people. But unlike the Stones and Vice Lords, the case fell apart. No major convictions were secured against the BGDs, though their funding was cut off. Mingo, however, paid the price for testifying. He was beaten severely on the streets by his own organization. The perception grew that authorities had specifically targeted the Stones while the BGDs slipped through. Origins of the GD-DD split. By 1971, cracks were appearing inside the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. Some disciples began rejecting BGD leadership altogether. Others still carry resentment from the old Gangster Disciples War of the 1960s. Factions broke away, loyalty fractured, and the seeds of the future GD-vs-BD war were quietly planted. Barksdale's legacy and early rumors. According to a 2004 report by the National Gang Crime Research Center, David Barksdale was not a kingpin in the traditional sense. His focus leaned more toward community activism within the disciple structure. Still, he carried a reputation that inspired both fear and respect. People said that even his presence could send chills through a room. At the same time, he showed generosity. In the early 1970s, Barksdale would visit Bryn Mawr School in South Shore and toss stacks of dollar bills to children in the yard. When Barksdale passed in 1974, he left a void. Almost immediately, rumors spread that Larry Hoover believed he should inherit Barksdale's title of king. This fueled division inside the Black Gangster Disciples. Some factions wanted Hoover dead, while others supported him. Old grudges between disciples and gangsters resurfaced, and the once ununified nation began to fracture. Civil War and splintering, 1974 to 1977. By 1976, Don Dirk Ackland stepped in on the disciple side to calm the storm. He drafted a constitution and bylaws for the black disciples while Hoover regained control of the gangsters. For a brief moment, order returned, but that peace quickly dissolved when the restructuring was seen as a betrayal. What followed was an all-out civil war between gangsters and black disciples, both in prison and on the street. Between 1974 and 1977, renegade groups like the Bowery Boys, Kingston Raiders, Mystery Knights, Stewart Raiders, and others operated outside BGDN law. Violence was constant. Only when high-ranking BGDs returned from prison in 1976 to 77 was order restored, bringing those groups back under BGDN's umbrella. Hoover's reformist vision. Even during the bloodshed of the 1970s, Larry Hoover envisioned something different. He wanted controlled wars, like those of the Italian Mafia, rather than messy street violence. He openly opposed prison rape and unnecessary killings. As he grew older, Hoover became more determined to guide young black men towards stability instead of chaos. April 18, 1978. A turning point. That vision took shape on April 18, 1978, inside Stateville Prison. Prisoners had long been served rotten food, and officials ignored their complaints. On this day, Hoover and leaders from multiple gangs, including the Black Disciples, Vice Lords, Latin Kings, and others, organized a work strike. Prison jobs stopped, and with no labor force, the administration was forced to improve conditions. This was a non-violent protest. Unlike anything seen before in Chicago's gang history, for the first time, rival groups realized they could work together. This moment laid the foundation for what later became known as the Folks and People's Alliances, Brothers of the Struggle, and the Stateville Riot. Later that same year, Hoover launched the Brothers of the Struggle, uniting several African-American gangs under a reformist banner. Initially, the movement pursued peaceful petitions for better conditions, but on July 22, 1978, frustration boiled over. 17 inmates staged a violent rebellion inside Stateville, leading to the deaths of 3 correctional officers. Although they were later acquitted, Hoover was placed in segregation and eventually transferred to Pontiac Prison to sever his direct ties. The rise of the insanes in the drug trade around this time, a new chapter began in the Cabrini Green projects. In 1978, Ernest Don Smokey Wilson was incarcerated, leaving his lieutenant Don Bojan King in charge. Bojan and his enforcer Junior Hope sought Hoover's blessing to expand the heroin trade. Hoover granted it, and the insane black gangster disciples were born, later known as the Insane Gangster Disciples. Cabrini Green quickly turned into one of the most profitable drug markets in Chicago. IGDs eliminated much of the King Cobra's influence through violence, then absorbed smaller groups like the Black Deuces. The operation ran like a military unit. Dealers worked shifts, security-controlled entry, and rooftop snipers with infrared scopes enforced discipline. Millions flowed through the towers, making Cabrini Green the crown jewel of GD profits, until the buildings were demolished in 2011. Expansion. Insanes in Rogers Park, 1978 to 1979. The Insane Disciples didn't stop at Cabrini. By 1979, they spread into Humboldt Park, East Garfield Park, and Rockwell Gardens. Around the same time, GDs began establishing themselves in Rogers Park along Howard Street, known as the Junway Jungle. GDs capitalized on an area collapsing under poverty, white flight, and abandoned housing. Here, they built the foundation for the LOC City GDs and ran a lucrative drug trade linked directly to Chicago's elevated train system. South Chicago GDs, 1979 to 1980. The late 1970s also saw a GD expansion into South Chicago, fueled by the collapse of the steel industry. Falling property values allowed poorer families to move in, and gangs followed. The Lakeside GDs emerged as one of the dominant sets, fighting against Black P. Stones, Latin Kings, and Latin Counts. Their presence remains in South Chicago to this day, western suburbs and beyond. The expansion of the GDs, 1979 to 1981. By the late 1970s, the Gangster Disciples began expanding beyond Chicago's south and west sides, spreading into the surrounding suburbs as racial tensions and economic decline created fertile ground for their growth. Maywood GDs, 1979. In 1976, the Latin Kings entered the suburb of Maywood, clashing with both white residents and the first wave of Mexican immigrants. By the late 1970s, these kings frequently targeted African American youths, hurling racial slurs and launching attacks. An article from 1978 documented these racial hostilities. African Americans had lived in Maywood since the 1950s, but economic decline, fueled by factory closures, triggered white flight and middle-class black flight. As lower-income African-American families moved into Maywood's apartments, racial conflict deepened. Youths soon turned to the Black Gangster Disciples for protection. By 1979, GDs had become the dominant African-American gang in Maywood, holding their ground against Latin Kings, Vice Lords, Black P. Stones, and four-corner hustlers. Despite being outnumbered, they remained strong and deeply rooted. Bellwood GDs, 1979. Just west of Maywood, the suburb of Bellwood faced similar changes. Apartment developments filled with new African-American residents from Chicago, and by 1979, the GDs had established themselves there as well. In Bellwood, they faced opposition from Latin Kings, Vice Lords, Black P. Stones, and four-corner hustlers, but the GDs endured and solidified their presence. Waukegan GDs, 1980. Waukegan had a history of racial division dating back to the 1920s. African Americans, concentrated on the South Side since the Great Migration, faced hostility for decades. When manufacturing plants began closing in 1979, white families moved out and impoverished Chicago families moved in, many with Section 8 housing vouchers. This migration sparked tensions, but also opened the door for the GDs. By 1980, they had firmly taken root in Waukegan's South Side housing projects, quickly becoming a dominant force. North Chicago GDs, 1980. North Chicago, heavily dependent on local manufacturing, was devastated by industrial decline. The Marion Jones housing projects, built in the early 1960s, became a hub for lower-income families. The GDs established themselves there by 1980, holding the projects until their demolition in the 2010 Zion GDs, 1980. The town of Zion had long been an unusual religious community, but became a destination for low-income African Americans when the Hebron projects were built in the 1960s. By 1980, as manufacturing jobs disappeared, Chicago families moved in. GDs and Vice Lords quickly clashed for control of the projects, with GDs emerging as a major presence by the 1990 Kane County GDs, 1980s Aurora GDs. 1980, Aurora, Illinois had public housing since the 1960s, but by the early 1980s, many projects were filled with families from Chicago. Local residents resented the influx, sparking racial conflict. Latin Kings and the St. Deces were already present, and African American youths turned to the GDs for strength and protection. By the 1990s, the GDs had become deeply embedded in Aurora, battling both Hispanic and rival black gang. Elgin GDs, 1980. Around the same time, GDs entered Elgin, settling primarily in the early 1980s. Though less visible than in Aurora, their presence has remained consistent for decades. Carpentersville GDs, 1980. In Carpentersville, GDs established themselves in the Foxview Apartments, a complex that became a hub for lower-income residents. There, GDs frequently fought against Hispanic gangs. In a largely white and Hispanic suburb, the GDs became the primary gang for African-American residents. Will County GDs, 1980. Joliet GDs, The Hill, 1980. Joliet was once an industrial powerhouse, attracting many African Americans who settled on the city's east side, but when factories closed, public housing projects began filling with Section 8 families from Chicago. Many came to Joliet to be closer to relatives incarcerated at the nearby prison. By 1980, GDs were firmly established in the east side projects, particularly the notorious Fairview homes. They clashed with Latin Kings, Vice Lords, and other rivals while running one of the most profitable drug operations in the city. The area became legendary as The Hill, encompassing both Joliet and the neighboring unincorporated Fairmont area. Stories of violence and survival from The Hill circulated widely, cementing its reputation as one of the most dangerous territories under GD control. Fairmont GDs, 1980. Fairmont, technically part of Lockport Township but unincorporated and neglected by both Joliet and Lockport police, became a lawless zone. Without consistent law enforcement or basic services, the area was ripe for gang control. By 1980, GDs had transformed Fairmont into a key base for their drug operations. Violence was frequent, and law enforcement often avoided the area altogether. For residents, the GD presence defined everyday life in this forgotten corner of Will County. Bolingbrook GDs, 1980. In 1980, Bolingbrook underwent rapid white flight. Apartments and townhouses were soon filled by African American and Hispanic families from Chicago. The GDs established themselves quickly, particularly in the Beacon Ridge townhomes and Wood Creek apartments. their influence spread across Bolingbrook, creating another stronghold outside the city. Rockwell Gardens, Gangsters in the Projects, 1980. Around 1980, Chicago's Rockwell Gardens housing projects began falling into decay. Vice lords dominated much of the complex, but in Building 2417, local youths resisted their influence. The Black Gangster Disciples seized the opportunity to move in, recruiting heavily and establishing control. Over time, GDs spread to other buildings, including the 340 and 417 units. Drug operations flourished, generating millions in profits until the projects were demolished in the 2000s. The final prison wars, 1980 to 1981. By the late 1970s, relative peace existed between the gangsters and Black disciples inside Stateville Prison, but tensions reignited in 1980 and reached a deadly climax on January 29, 1981. The conflict centered on George Bailey, a Black disciple who held a privileged position as a cell house helper. Ernest Smokey Wilson, a powerful GD leader from Cabrini Green, declared that all BDs must either resign from such posts or align with the gangsters. While some complied, Bailey refused, sparking weeks of defiance. When Wilson attempted to enforce his order, violence erupted. GD member Fred Bo Collins struck Bailey with an aluminum bat, causing fatal injuries. Bailey died on February 5, 1981, solidifying the rift between the two sides. The split BGD versus BD in 1981. In the aftermath of Bailey's death, Dirk Ackland consolidated leadership of the Black Disciples, while Larry Hoover and his allies took control of the Gangster Disciples. By 1981, the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, BGD, was no more. The organization split permanently. Those loyal to Hoover became BGDs, while others aligned with Ackland's Black Disciples, BDs. For many neighborhoods, this split was decisive. Communities had to choose whether to follow the gangsters or the disciples. The majority went with Hoover's GDs, making them the largest gang in Chicago. That same year, Larry Hoover abandoned the title of king and instead became known as the chairman. He began restructuring the GDs with new rules, forbidding violence against prison staff without direct orders and steering the organization toward political influence. Hoover's transition away from being a crime boss marked the beginning of his reformist reputation, one that would later complicate federal prosecutors' efforts to convict him under RICO charges in the 1990s. The rise of the Black Gangster Disciples in public housing, 1981 to 1988. By 1981, the Black Gangster Disciples were firmly entrenched in Chicago's public housing. In Cabrini Green alone, their membership swelled past 400. That same year, both the Gangster Disciples and Black Disciples began operating large-scale drug networks inside the Robert Taylor homes and Stateway Gardens, operations that would become legendary in years to come. Within the Robert Taylors, the GDs became the dominant force, controlling the buildings from Pershing Road down to 43rd Street, with significant influence extending to 46. They battled fiercely against the Cobra Stones throughout the 1970s, gradually taking over buildings that once belonged to their rivals. By the 1980s, structures like 4101, 3919, 4037, and 4022 were firmly under GD control. Even the 4950 building, located deep in Black Disciple territory, fell to the GDs. Brothers of the Struggle, 1982. In 1982, Larry Hoover advanced his organizational vision by officially establishing Brothers of the Struggle, a structure designed exclusively for BGDs. Internal memos from Hoover at the time encouraged members to refine themselves, improve discipline, and elevate the organization beyond simple street survival. That same year, tensions between BGDs and BDs nearly cooled as Black Disciple leader Dirk Ackland returned from prison. Disturbed by Jerome Freeman's growing power, Ackland broke away and created a rival BD faction called the Asiatic Apostles. A brief civil war erupted within the BDs, diverting their attention away from the BDs. By 1983-84, Ackland's faction reunited with the rest of the BDs, but the split temporarily gave BDs breathing room, expansion into the suburbs, 1982 to 1985. By 1982, the Gangster Disciples were no longer confined to Chicago's south and west sides. They expanded into the suburbs, often following migration patterns as African-American families moved out of the city. Evanston, 1982, the GDs emerged as the largest gang on the west side of Evanston, quickly outpacing rivals like the Vice Lords and El Roots. They have maintained strong numbers there ever since. Calumet City. Once a bastion of Italian organized crime, Calumet City changed rapidly as African American and Hispanic families moved into its apartments. GD seized the opportunity and built a lasting presence. Hoffman Estates, 1985. Despite its reputation as a quiet, mostly white suburb, Hoffman Estates saw GD activity by the mid-1980s. Section 8 relocations brought African American families into the Governor's Lane townhouses where GDs gained a foothold. These suburban factions proved violent and resilient, even clashing with and reportedly eliminating the local Latin Kings. Police eventually installed surveillance cameras in the area to monitor the gang's activity. The birth of the Gangster Disciples Nation in 1985. In 1985, Larry Hoover introduced a major shift. He officially dropped the word black from the organization's name, declaring that all members would now operate under the banner of the Gangster Disciples within the broader Gangster Disciple Nation, GDN. A new hierarchy was also established, consisting of board members at the top, followed by governors and regents. Younger members embraced the new GD identity, tagging it across Chicago walls. Though many older members still referred to themselves as BGDs, the change marked a turning point. By the mid-1980s, Gangster Disciples had become the name recognized on the streets and even in media reports. Larry Hoover's next step, reform, 1987. In March 1987, Hoover was transferred to Vienna Correctional Center, a minimum security facility. His move was seen as a reward for years of disciplined behavior, including his earlier policy forbidding violence against prison staff. From Vienna, Hoover focused less on street-level crime and more on reform and political organization. He introduced the concept of better growth and development, redefining BGD to stand for these words. The philosophy aimed to help members uplift themselves, strengthen their communities, and pursue legitimate success. Though not yet public at the time, it marked a dramatic shift in Hoover's leadership. Meanwhile, without Hoover's calming influence, chaos returned to Stateville and Pontiac prisons. Violent plots surfaced, including an attempt to assassinate prison superintendent Robert Taylor. While Hoover was not involved, the events triggered investigations that revealed the inner workings of the GD's prison structure. Marquette Park, GD's 1987. Marquette Park, long a flashpoint of racial tension, had been home to white resistance movements since the 1960s, including the American Nazi Party. By the late 1980s, demographic changes were underway, with African American families moving into the neighborhood's east side. The transition sparked clashes with white gangs and Hispanic groups such as Ambrose and 2-6. In 1987, the Black Gangster Disciples moved in to protect black youths facing harassment. They quickly became both enforcers and moneymakers along 63rd Street. By the 1990s, GDs were entrenched, even battling the Black Disciples for dominance. Big Chuck Dorsey and the Outlaw Gangster Disciples, late 1980, Breedy Green was a stronghold for the insane Gangster Disciples, but other GD factions like the High Supreme Gangsters also operated there. Among the youth was Charles Big Chuck Dorsey, born and raised in the projects. By age 18, he had founded his own faction, the Renegade Crew, which openly defied the GDs and unleashed heavy violence against them. Eventually, Dorsey aligned with the insane GDs, creating a new breakaway group, the Outlaw Gangster Disciples. A towering figure with a reputation as a ruthless killer, Dorsey built a lucrative drug empire in Cabrini Green throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The Outlaws, alongside the insane GDs, effectively controlled Cabrini Green until Dorsey's death in January 1996, Summit Argo GD's 1989. In the late 1980s, the suburb of Summit Argo in Cook County saw a sharp increase in African American migration, particularly south of 63rd Street and west of Harlem Avenue. By 1989, many families were settling in homes and others in a public housing structure on 63rd Place between 74th and 75th Avenue. This complex began accepting Section 8 residents from Chicago, bringing in youth who soon clashed with Latin Kings from nearby 63rd and Harlem. The Gangster Disciples, along with the Black Souls and Vice Lords, moved into these projects, but the Summit Argo GDs quickly gained a legendary reputation. Even outside Cook County, their name carried weight throughout the 1990s. They fought long, violent wars with the Latin Kings and Vice Lords until the projects were demolished in 2007. After that, their presence faded into uncertainty. Glendale Heights, GDs, 1989. That same year, Section 8 families from Chicago were relocated into apartment and townhouse complexes in Glendale Heights, an affluent DuPage County suburb. Many African American youth struggled to assimilate in this mostly white middle-class environment. Facing harassment from local Latin Kings, they turned to the Black Gangster Disciples for protection and identity. The GDs rooted themselves in places like the Emerald Hills apartments and Cambria condos. They became a feared suburban presence, clashing bitterly with Latin Kings throughout the 1990s. Their numbers remained strong until the early 2000s, when law enforcement forced Chicago gangs out of the area. Hispanic and white GDs in Chicago and the suburbs. While the Gangster Disciples were born out of black empowerment, their concepts were never built on racism. The organization discouraged reliance on white-controlled institutions, but it was not hostile toward whites or Hispanics. In fact, GDs often allied with groups like the Saman City Royals and worked with Latin folks. Still, prior to the 1980s, the presence of non-black GDs was rare, limited mainly to Chicago's uptown neighborhood in the 1970s. By the late 1980s, as the gang expanded deeper into suburban territories and wars with vice lords and Latin kings escalated, recruitment widened. White and Hispanic youths began joining in growing numbers, strengthening GD influence outside the city. Romeoville GD's 1989. Romeoville, a suburb southwest of Chicago, became one of the most significant centers for non-black Gangster Disciples. The gang's roots there trace back to a Chicago GD known as Moon Rock. Originally, the Latin Kings were the dominant presence, but as tensions grew, the GDs established themselves to rival them. By the early 1990s, the Romeoville GDs were large and active, composed mostly of white and Hispanic members, with a handful of black members. Their presence was visible, old desks and textbooks marked with BGD and BGDN graffiti. They quickly gained a reputation for violence, shootings, arson, and firebombings, made headlines in the mid-1990s. Yet many members eventually transitioned into very different lives. Some became professional fighters, others working-class fathers and family men. Romeoville remains one of the earliest and strongest non-black GD sections in the Chicago area. Blue City and Cicero Hell Zone GDs early 1990. By 1992, GD expansion into Chicago's Lakeview neighborhood gave rise to one of the most unique branches of Blue City. African American cliques like the 8-Ball Posse, Bubbly Boys, and Godfathers merged into the Gangster Disciples at Hawthorne Park near Seminary Avenue and School Street. When the Puerto Rican Stones pulled out of Belmont and Clifton, the GDs absorbed many Hispanic and white youths into their ranks, forming a multiracial set. This movement spread into Cicero, where the 49th Street Boys evolved into the feared Hell Zone GDs. They fought bitterly against both folks and people gangs, especially the 2-2 Boys and Latin Kings. The Cicero GDs even built ties with family in Mexico, creating a small but notable drug pipeline. Meanwhile, in the Gage Park community, GDs absorbed former 2-6 members around 59th and Campbell. By the 1990s, white and Hispanic youths in Gage Park gravitated heavily toward the GDs, though the section eventually faded by the late 2000s. CD versus BD permanent war. By the late 1980s, drug trade competition between Gangster Disciples and Black Disciples in Inglewood was already turning bloody. In 1989, shootings erupted that foreshadowed the war to come. In the summer of 1991, GDs killed Black Disciple member Mickey Bull. On August 7th, the BDs retaliated by killing several GDs in Inglewood. Around this time, younger members on 66th Street began calling themselves strictly Gangster Disciples, dropping the black altogether. Court documents from these cases officially recorded them as GD. Meanwhile, Larry Hoover was promoting his reformist concept of growth and development. Though its initials matched, the movement was separate from the name change. Still, the violent wars between GDs and BDs raged from 1991 through 1994, making their neighborhoods war zones. By 1993, growth and development was made official, but peace with the BDs collapsed permanently in 1994. From that year forward, the BGD name disappeared, replaced simply by GD. Kankakee GDs and the growth and development era. Economic decline hit Kankakee hard in the early 1980s, leaving many neighborhoods impoverished. African American and Hispanic families from Chicago moved in, and by the mid-1980s, the Gangster Disciples were firmly established. In 1993, Larry Hoover launched a political arm called 21st Century VOE, and seeking to channel GD influence into politics. At the same time, he pushed growth and development as the gang's new identity, focused on uplifting communities rather than destroying them. That same year, more than 10,000 GDs gathered in Kankakee for a picnic where Hoover delivered a recorded speech. Letters flooded the governor's office in support of his parole, but in 1995, the opposite happened. Operation Headache. The crackdown arrested 39 top GD leaders, including Hoover, who was eventually sent to ADX Florence Supermax in Colorado, cutting them off from the outside world almost entirely. Crack cocaine operations. Even as Hoover was pushing reform, the GDs were running one of the most lucrative drug operations in American history. Starting in the late 1980 and peaking in the early 1990, they controlled the Robert Taylor Homes, Cabrini Green, Stateway Gardens, and Dearborn Homes. In Cabrini Green alone, their crack cocaine operation generated more than $100 million. Soldiers worked in shifts, selling drugs 24 hours a day, while armed GD security patrolled the buildings, imposed curfews, and even frisked residents. Rules were strict. Those who refused orders could be beaten or killed. The GDs turned neglected public housing into militarized drug fortresses. For poor use abandoned by the city, the gang provided money, food, and identity. By the mid-1990s, GD membership swelled to more than 35,000 members, funded largely by these operations. Back of the Yards GDs. By the late 1990s, the Back of the Yards neighborhood was undergoing major change. Hispanic families, once the dominant presence, began moving out. Along with them, long-established gangs like the Latin Souls and the Bishops left the area. Even the Satan Disciples began pulling back south of 51st Street by the early 2000s. As African-American families moved into the community, the Gangster Disciples followed. What began as a small presence soon grew into a powerful foothold. GDs quickly took over former Bishop turf around 53rd and Winchester, Old Latin Soul territory at 49th and Hermitage, and parts of the Satan Disciples' old ground near 51st and Wood. Their ranks swelled, and they even recruited former Latin Souls at 49th and Paulina, who became known as Mexican GDs. Within just a few years, the GDs had established themselves as one of the largest and strongest organizations in Back of the Yards. Ashburn GDs. A similar shift unfolded in Ashburn during the early 2000s. Another wave of white flight hit the neighborhood, and African-American families took their place, particularly in the western sections. The Gangster Disciples moved in quickly, recruiting aggressively and building their numbers. But unlike in Back of the Yards, the biggest threat to GDs in Ashburn often came from within. Clique wars broke out, with GD sets turning their guns on each other. While the Black P. Stones had been active in Ashburn since the 1980s, their conflict with GDs never grew to the same scale because most of the violence in the area was GD versus DD. Still, the map of Ashburn reflected overlapping claims. GDs shared ground with the Black P. Stones on the east side of the community, east of Kesey, and with the Black Disciples near 79th and Holman. Conclusion: the story of the Gangster Disciples is not just one of drugs and violence. Since the 1960s, there has always been another side: activism, organization, and a message of building rather than destroying. For decades, the leadership encouraged members to live with discipline, supporting their families, protecting their neighborhoods, and carrying themselves with pride. Many of the older members, even those once convicted of serious crimes, later spoke out about the importance of responsibility, leadership, and guiding young Black men toward becoming productive members of society. To them, being a disciple wasn't only about the street life. It could mean working a job, participating in GD politics, or even being involved in crime without turning on your own community. That philosophy, brothers of the struggle, still exists today, though many younger GDs have lost touch with those roots. Some don't even know who Larry Hoover is. In recent years, the organization has fractured into warring factions. The violence is often more intense between rival GD sets than with their traditional enemies like the Black Disciples or People Nation gangs. Structure has broken down, and what remains in many areas is chaos. Larry Hoover. Much of the debate today centers on Larry Hoover. During President Trump's term, talk of a pardon stirred national attention. Critics argue against his release, but the facts tell a different story. The sweeping charges from the 1995 federal indictments have never been supported by credible evidence from the streets, only by the testimony of informants. Hoover had already stepped away from controlling street operations by the early 1980s. By 1987, prison officials even moved him to a lower security facility because he was no longer viewed as a threat. It is unrealistic to think Hoover was running multi-million-dollar operations from behind bars in the 1990s. By then, younger leaders weren't taking orders from him, and no serious profits were being funneled his way. His philosophy of growth and development was intended as a path toward reform. But many who adopted it twisted it for their own gain. That loss of control has been the story of Chicago gangs for decades. Leaders in prison cannot maintain true authority over the streets. Hoover's original 1973 conviction came from the killing of Pookie, a drug dealer who had been robbing dope houses with violence and threats. He was no innocent man. To argue that Hoover should remain in prison for that crime, while Chicago still glorifies Al Capone, who committed similar offenses but was white, reveals a double standard. Both men built criminal empires, but neither targeted innocent civilians. The difference is race. Since the late 1970s, Hoover has gone through multiple phases of reform. By 1981, he has stepped down from leadership, and since then he has carried himself as a model prisoner. Today, he has no real influence left in the streets. Younger GDs would never recognize him as a leader again, and the older generation is mostly retired, working community fundraisers, mentoring youth, or struggling with age and illness. So the question remains, should Larry Hoover be free? Based on history, reform, and fairness, the answer is yes. Final note, the Gangster Disciples legacy is complex. It is a story of violence, survival, community activism, and fractured leadership. From the neighborhoods of Chicago to the suburbs, the GD name still carries weight, but the meaning behind it has shifted with each generation. The original message of structure and uplift is not gone, but in many places it has been buried beneath chaos, infighting, and forgotten history.